Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. For those that don't know me, my name is Anne-Marie Bainton, and I am part of the Live Green Toronto team at the City of Toronto, and I'm the manager of the PollinateTO Community Grants. Tonight we have a very special presentation, Trees for Bees and Other Pollinators with Tara Mabon. Tonight's session is the fourth in the PollinateTO Info series, so thank you so much for being here. And before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So just so everyone knows, tonight's session, it will be recorded and we will post it to Live Green Toronto's YouTube channel and the PollinateTO website. And there will definitely be an opportunity to ask any questions that you have to Tara at the end of the presentation. But as you're listening, and if you do have questions, please enter them into the box on the side in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we will get to them in the end. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Tara joined the City of Toronto in 2018. In her current role as an Operations Support Officer, she helps administer the Urban Forestry Grants and Incentives Program and provides technical support and training to residents and community groups interested in increasing Toronto's canopy on private land. Tara holds an Honours Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and a graduate certificate in Ecosystem Restoration. We are so grateful to have her with us tonight to introduce us to some of the native trees and shrubs that are suitable for the Toronto area. We hope that this talk will help you select the best species for your garden. Please welcome Tara.
Hey everyone, thanks Anne-Marie. Hi, so my name is Tara. I'm going to talk to you about not just some species that might be of interest to you in increasing pollinator space in the city, but I'm also going to touch base about what to think about when you're thinking of planting a tree in the city, some tips for maintaining your tree so that it lives a really long and happy life. So give me 1 sec and I'll throw up the presentation. Okay, so yep, that's me again. All right, so trees and shrubs for pollinators. A lot of the time, I think we find that trees and shrubs are often overlooked when it comes to pollinator gardens and plants for pollinators. Pollinators need an access to a diversity of plants with overlapping blooming times so that flowers are available to them from early spring in the beginning of the year to late fall. And trees and shrubs are a really great way to fill in the gaps when flowering herbaceous plants, which are plants that aren't woody, don't have woody parts to them, are not in bloom. So some benefits that trees and shrubs provide pollinators include they're an early food source. For example, maples, birch, and willow trees are some of the first trees to bloom in the early spring. In fact, they're some of the first anything to bloom in the spring. So they're really good for when pollinators are coming out of hibernation and there's nothing else growing at the time. So that's an important source of food for them. Another thing is that trees and shrubs provide a really large source of food for pollinators. They have a large amount of food in one location. So it means that pollinators are able to more efficiently gather food for themselves. They don't have to travel as far or expend as much energy in searching for food. Trees and shrubs are also really important because they provide leaves, stems, and woody materials, which pollinators can then use for nesting material, and for overwintering material. For example, carpenter bees use dead woody material or hollowed out stems to lay their eggs in and to shelter in. Leafcutter bees, for example, really like redbud tree leaves to line their nests with. And then there's several pollinators that also use autumn leaves or dead woody material like branches and standing trunks to overwinter in. Pollinators overwinter as eggs or caterpillars or even as adults. I don't know if you've seen in the last few years, there's been an effort to make people aware that they should leave their leaves on the ground well into the spring until the temperatures are really warm. And that's because there's all sorts of pollinators and other beneficial insects that have been using that leaf cover over the winter. So before you clear it up, you might want to wait till it's consistently warm out. It's also a good idea just to leave that material around in general if you're thinking about making a pollinator garden. And then lastly, trees and shrubs play a really important role as larval hosts for butterflies. One of the most famous examples of a larval host is milkweed, which is the host plant for monarch butterflies. But other types of butterflies also require host plants. For example, the eastern tiger swallowtail, which is what we have pictured here, it uses the tulip tree as a host plant. So they're really important for that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about tree anatomy, just because it's important, to have a basic understanding of what makes a tree, and it's also going to help you when it comes to caring for your tree as well. So basic anatomy of a tree includes the crown. So the crown of the tree is the top of the tree. It's made up of the leaves and the branches. The crown supports the leaves, which produce the food for the tree through photosynthesis. You have the leader, which is the main upright stem of the tree. So not really the trunk, but like the upper part. Then you have the trunk itself, which supports the crown. It gives the tree its shape and also its strength. The trunk also contains an important network of tubes that run between the roots and the leaves and helps pass food from the leaves down to the roots and minerals and water from the roots up into the leaves. It also supports the bark, which protects the tree from physical damage and disease. We have the root collar, also sometimes called the root flare. This is where the trunk meets the roots. It's made of the same material as the trunk, and it plays a really important role in the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the inner bark of the tree. And then we have the roots, which anchor the tree into the ground and provide the tree with water and oxygen, minerals, and it also is where food is stored over the winter for the tree. And then we have the drip line. This isn't actually a physical part of the tree. It's more like an imaginary line from the outer edge of the crown going to the ground. And I point that out because it can come in handy when it comes to maintaining your tree. So just keep that in mind for later. I also like to bring up the root structure of a tree, just because a lot of times people may think that tree roots are more like the image on the left, where the roots go straight down into the soil. And there are roots that go straight down, and there are certain trees that have roots that go down rather than across. But for the most part, tree roots are like the image on the right. So they spread out horizontally, sometimes between 2 to 3 times the size of the crown of the tree. And they like to stay in the upper meter of soil because that's where the most oxygen and water can be found. The further down you go into the soil, the less available water and oxygen is. So that's really important for the tree as well. And it's something you want to think about when you're going to plant your tree, because not only are you dealing with your tree growing above ground and the space it takes up there, but you want to think about like how much space it's going to take up underground as well. So I'm going to touch on some urban tree stresses because I'm going to assume that if you're listening to this presentation, you might be in an urban area and you're thinking of planting trees in an urban area. So urban trees work really hard in urban areas. They provide us with a lot of benefits, but they are also under a lot of stress. Some stresses in urban areas include a lack of nutrients. Soil nutrients get leached out of the soil because of excessive salt use in the winter. Excessive amounts of dog urine or pet urine can also change the soil and can become a problem for trees. Soil compaction and erosion is a really big problem in the city. from foot traffic or vehicle traffic. When the soil becomes compacted, it makes it difficult for roots to expand. It holds less water and oxygen than uncompacted soil. Erosion's a big problem too. If you've ever walked through a ravine, I'm sure you've seen some erosion taking place around trees. It exposes the roots and makes the tree less stable. There's also a lot of hardscape in the city. So when I say hardscape and hard surfaces, I'm referring to sidewalks, driveways, roads. That not only restricts space for roots to grow, but it also reduces the amount of water from rain sources that are going to get into the ground because it all washes away down the drain. Mechanical damage, this can be anything from, you know, a car running into a tree, most often lawn keeping equipment like lawn owners. My biggest pet peeve, which is locking your bicycle to a tree. Please don't do that. So they have to deal with that. Competition from invasive species, but also just from regular grass, because grass is very thick and it uses a lot of resources like water as well. And then I'm going to touch more on this in the next slide, but oftentimes trees are not successful because we put the wrong tree in the wrong place. So that's something I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about what kind of trees and shrubs you want to put in a pollinator garden. So before you plant a tree or a shrub, it's a good idea to ask yourself the following questions. This is going to help you choose the appropriate species for the available space and the conditions that you're working with. Some trees and shrubs are generalists. They are very happy to live and thrive and grow in, you know, whatever conditions you put them in. But there are most certainly species out there that are very particular about where they're put. They like very specific conditions, and if you don't put them there, they're not going to grow. So just keep that in mind. Some things you want to think about, why do you want to plant a tree? In our case, we probably are looking to attract pollinators to our yard. But some other things you might want to consider is, do you want more shade? Is privacy concerned? You can even plant trees to help reduce noise from the neighborhood around you. Where is your tree going? How much space do you have to actually plant this tree? Because that's going to determine what kind of tree you can put there, what kind of shrub, because you have to keep in mind, like, it's a small tree now, but in 20 years down the road, it could be quite large depending on the species. Are there any conflicts that you need to deal with or that your tree could eventually come up against as it grows? Conflicts include things like underground or overhead utilities, property lines or nearby structures like sidewalks. Other existing trees can be an issue as well. Future construction plans. Is that space going to become a construction site? You don't want to plant a tree and then have to like pull it up a year later. And then what is the space being used for currently? You don't want to plant a tree where kids usually play, for example. Is it going to get in the way? Maybe the tree will get damaged. And then what does your tree need to survive and thrive? Like I said, some species are very particular about the type of soil and the amount of sunlight and water they get. So that's something you really want to take into consideration as well. Another thing to think about too when you're going to plant your tree is sometimes you might want to think about planting your tree strategically. You can plant your tree to provide shade, etc. But you can also plant your tree to provide energy savings as well. For example, maybe you plant a tree on the south side of your house that provides shade throughout the summer, or you can plant an evergreen tree on the north side of your house, which can provide buffering during the winter from northern winds. So that's something you might want to think about as well. So once you've thought all about that, you've thought really, really hard, and you finally decided what tree or shrub that you're going to bring home and you're going to plant, there's still a couple things you need to do. You want to get your tree home safely. If you can't fit your tree completely in your car, if it's bigger than like a 1 or 2 gallon pot tree, then it's a good idea to wrap the branches so that they remain secure. You don't want leaves and branches getting broken off or breaking during your ride home if the tree has to stick out of your car, for example. So you can wrap it in a tarp or some burlap, for example, just to make sure it retains as many leaves as possible. Also, don't leave it in your car, especially when it's warm out. It will get very, very stressed out. So don't forget it in there. You want to also properly handle your tree. I see people grabbing trees by like the trunk and the stems, and that's generally not a good idea. It puts stress on the tree, especially when they're smaller. If you can, it's better to hold it by the container. That way you don't have to worry about breaking it off, breaking any branches off. Next step before you do any digging is you need to call before you dig. And when I say call before you dig, I mean you need to locate underground utilities in the area that you plan on planting in. It's actually the law in Ontario to locate underground utilities before doing any digging. A lot of people think, you know, you're digging a really small hole for like a very small tree. I'm sure I'm not going to hit anything. But it's best to never assume that underground utilities are buried deeper than you plan to dig. In some cases, utility lines are very, very close to the surface. So you want to just take that precaution. You can call Ontario One Call. They're a nonprofit organization that facilitates excavation locate requests. So it's really easy to do. If you don't, you run the risk of you can hurt yourself, or you can get a costly service interruption and shut down your water. So just call. And then lastly, you want to plant your tree soon. You don't want to bring your tree home and leave it in its pot for an extended period of time. You want to try and plant it right away. If that's not possible, you can keep the tree in the container for a little while. I usually recommend no more than 2 weeks, but you want to keep it out of direct sunlight and wind. You want to keep the roots moist, but not wet until you're able to plant it. Okay, I have a short video on planting your tree, so let's see if it works. Forgive me if it doesn't.
Welcome everyone, my name's Karen. I work for the City of Toronto Forestry Department. I'm gonna show you how to plant a tree today. So the first thing you need to do when you plant a tree is dig a hole. So what we're gonna do with our shovel is we're gonna cut through the turf. And we want this hole to be a little deeper than the pot that we're planting. So now I'm just gonna pop this out. Sometimes they get a little stuck. If they do, you can squish them a bit and that helps to take them out. So just pull gently. If you've got lots of roots going around and around in a circle, you wanna just pull them down a bit. Otherwise, they might strangle themselves because they've gotten used to growing around in a pot. So we're just gonna stretch these out a little bit. We want the top of the soil to be even with the ground. I'm gonna put the dirt in and I'm gonna tuck it all around, make sure there's no air pockets. And I'm gonna step around it. This is a mulch mat and this helps to keep the weeds down. And the last thing we do is we put 2 buckets of mulch around our tree. We don't want the mulch touching the tree. And make sure the tree is nice and free and clear of any mulch. And we want the mulch about 2 or 3 inches thick. This helps to keep the weeds down and it helps to keep moisture in the soil. And that's how you plant a tree.
That's it. It's pretty straightforward. There are a ton of resources online for planting a tree. Obviously, it depends on the size of the tree. I'm going to assume that you're going to be getting a relatively small tree, like a 1 or 2 gallon pot, which is what was shown in the video. So it's pretty straightforward. Most important part is you don't want to dig the hole too deep because remember back earlier when I had mentioned the trunk flare. So you want to make sure that's above the ground. One of the biggest planting mistakes that people make is they put their tree in too deep and they actually cover the trunk flare. And that can lead to problems with the tree later on as it starts to mature. So that would be my advice going forward with that. So once you've planted your tree, aftercare and maintenance of your tree is just as important. If you take care of your tree or your shrub after it's been planted properly, you're gonna give it the best chance of growing and reaching maturity and being safe. We want to make sure our trees are safe as they grow. One of the most important steps is mulching. Mulch is organic matter that you spread around the base of the tree. Usually it's wood chips, but you can also have gravel mulch, for example. It's important to apply the mulch properly. A lot of times you'll see what we call the mulch volcano, which is the photo on the right there. We don't want a mulch volcano. What's when you pile the mulch right up against the trunk of the tree. When you do that, you're creating a really moist and warm environment, which can lead to the bark of your tree starting to rot. And when that happens, you're opening up your tree for disease or pests to take hold. So it's important not to do that. It happens all the time. I'm sure you've seen it just walking around your city. Landscapers do it. It's a little pet peeve of mine. I sometimes actually go in after them and fix it for them. What you do want though is a mulch donut, which is what the photo on the left is showing. So a mulch donut is basically what it sounds like. You kind of want to hollow out the middle of it so it resembles a donut. Mulch is really important because it helps insulate the soil, it buffers it and the roots against really hot and cold temperatures. It helps keep the roots moist so you don't have to water it as often. It prevents soil compaction and root compaction. If somebody walked over that mulch, it kind of absorbs the impact of people walking over it. It also helps protect the trunk from damage from lawn equipment because it creates kind of a buffer zone. If somebody's mowing around it, they're not going to necessarily mow over that mound of mulch. You want a 2 to 4 inch layer. You don't want it too high. Watering is also incredibly important, especially during the first 2 to 3 years of your new tree's life. Watering is really critical. During the first couple growing seasons, your newly planted tree is going to be expending a lot of energy trying to get its roots established in the soil. So during the first few summers, it's going to be difficult for your tree to deal with extreme heat or drought. So especially for those first 2-3 years, you want to make sure you water it a couple times a week. If it's really dry, if it's really wet, obviously you can use your judgment. You might even want to step up the amount you water it during really extreme heat periods. I always find that if you stick your hand underneath the mulch and it feels pretty dry, it's probably time to water it. And then where to water within the drip line. So that's why I mentioned the drip line earlier. It's a good indicator of where you should be putting the water so it can be most effectively be taken up by the tree. Okay, pruning. Pruning is really good. It can encourage your tree to develop a strong structure, and it also reduces the likelihood of your tree being damaged during severe weather if it's pruned properly. That being said, if you over prune your tree, you can weaken your tree and make it more susceptible to disease and pests. So be very cautious when you're approaching pruning your tree. It's easy to get it wrong. I always advise you to do some research, especially on the particular tree or shrub that you're pruning. Some trees are better pruned during specific seasons. For example, sometimes it's better to prune them in the winter. Some shrubs are better pruned after they've flowered, for example, to keep it healthy. So it's better to do your research. When you first plant your tree, though, you can do some light pruning. And light pruning means like pruning off any broken or dead branches, any excess leaders. So that means a good formed tree basically has one leader or one central stem. If you have two and you leave them there, they can eventually grow into each other and compete, trying to be the central stem. So it's better just to have one. Biggest thing though for pruning is you want to be safe. Rule of thumb, if you can't prune your tree with both your feet on the ground, it's time to call a certified arborist. You don't want to fool around with pruners in a tree on a ladder if you're not experienced at this. So please be safe, do your research, and call a professional in if you don't think it's safe for you to do it. Some other considerations when it comes to maintaining your tree are tree guards. Young trees have really thin bark that can be easily damaged by animals and lawn equipment. Mulch does a pretty good job of protecting it from lawn equipment, but animals like rabbits and mice, you can eat tree bark when they're younger, especially in the winter when food is scarce. So if you put a tree guard on there, that can help protect it against it. Staking, so putting some stakes on your newly planted tree. I don't normally recommend it unless the tree is in a very exposed area, like it's a very windy spot, because trees actually establish more quickly and develop stronger trunk and root systems if they're not staked when they're planted. As the tree moves in the wind, it encourages it to grow a stronger trunk and root system. So leaving the stakes off can actually help it. Fertilizing, not really necessary unless an arborist suggests you do. You can overdose your tree with fertilizer and harm the roots, so it's something you should approach with caution. And then tree health and tree safety. You want to keep an eye on your tree. You don't want to just plant it and leave it and hope for the best. You should be checking your tree on a fairly regular basis, like not every day, but take some time every once in a while to actually look at your tree. Are there branches that are rubbing against each other? Because that can create a problem down the road. Are there any dead branches that have showed up all of a sudden? Cavities, maybe there's fungus growing out of the tree. That could be a sign that something's wrong with it. You also want to inspect your trees after every storm, because maybe some branches have become broken and they're hanging in the tree. Those are things you want to deal with right away. So you want to make sure you look at your tree on a regular basis, and if you catch anything, it's easier to fix it or help it get better if you catch it right away. You don't want to leave it till down the road when it becomes a really big problem. And then another really important aftercare and maintenance is finding an arborist and knowing when you should contact an arborist to help you with your tree. So an arborist is an individual who is trained in the art and science of planting and caring for and maintaining individual trees. Some reasons why you might want to hire an arborist include they can help determine the type of pruning necessary to maintain and improve the health and appearance and safety of trees. They can help you decide whether a tree should be removed if it's a dangerous tree, for example, or if it's dying and it's going to pose a risk to your property. They can assist with performing emergency tree care in a safe manner, such as after storms. And they can also help with preventive maintenance to keep your tree in good health and reduce insect and pest problems. Some things you want to look for when it comes to finding an arborist is you want to find somebody, with membership to a professional organization, such as the International Society of Arboriculture. This certification means, they've done the training, they've also put in a certain number of hours in their profession, so they have the experience as well. You also want to ask for some proof of insurance. A reputable arborist carries personal and property damage insurance as well as workers' compensation insurance, so you want to make sure that's in place. You should ask for references for work that's similar to what you're requesting. Get multiple estimates for the job being performed. And you want to make sure you get everything in writing. Read the contract carefully and don't be afraid to ask questions. There are a lot of people out there with chainsaws that say they're arborists, but that might not necessarily be the case, so do your research first. An arborist is a good person to know and have a good one lined up if your tree ever runs into any problems. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of my suggestions for some native trees and shrubs that you might want to consider adding to your pollinator garden. But before I do that, I wanted to touch on invasive species really quickly. Just because invasive species are a threat to Toronto's urban forest. And it's something that we as gardeners and people creating pollinator gardens can help combat by choosing native plants or being really careful with which non-native species that you choose to put in your gardens or where you choose to plant those species. Another thing too is native pollinators have co-evolved alongside native plants. So as a result, they're able to collect pollen and nectar from these plants more efficiently than some of the non-native plants that they might also try and visit. So this makes food foraging them for them more efficient. Invasive plants usually take hold in an area, from construction or erosion or pollution deteriorating natural habitats. They're also really aggressive typically. They have high reproductive and growth rates, and they usually lack natural predators in a new area. Invasive plants can prevent native plants from growing and decrease available habitat and food for native wildlife. It's also really costly to remove invasive species once they've become established. So if we can kind of prevent them from taking hold, it helps us in the long run because you don't have to spend time and money and energy in trying to remove them. So if you are, planting, you might want to consider native plants. Or if you are choosing non-native plants, because there are definitely non-native plants that are good for pollinators too, maybe just be a little careful with where you're planting them. For example, if you're next to a natural area or a ravine system, you might want to take that into consideration. Plants don't know or care about boundaries or fences or anything, so it's very easy for them to jump a fence and start spreading if we're not careful. And just as an example, these are some invasive species, trees and shrubs in Toronto that were introduced as horticultural species that have escaped captivity, and now they're a problem in our natural areas and ravines. So just something to keep in mind. Not all non-native plants are bad. We just need to be careful of which ones we choose and where we put them. Okay, so I'm going to go over some native trees and shrubs that are great pollinator species. So the first one here, red maple, or really any maples, but red maple is a good maple for urban areas. It's pretty hardy. It's an important early food source in the spring. It's one of the first things that blooms in the spring. The seeds also attract birds. It has the benefit too of having really beautiful fall color as well. We have hackberry. Hackberry, despite the kind of not nice name, is a really, really great tree for urban conditions. It's very hardy, very tolerant to salt and other urban conditions. It's also a really good shade tree, gets quite big. It's a host plant to different types of butterflies, and the fruit it produces supports birds as well. Basswood is a fantastic tree for pollinators. It's actually also known as a bee tree because it produces a ton of nectar, really good overall wildlife tree. Lots of blossoms, the birds are attracted to the seeds, good shade tree. The leaves are also really nutrient rich, so if you do have a basswood tree, you can mow the leaves into your lawn with a lawnmower and it basically acts as fertilizer. Eastern redbud, probably one of the prettiest trees on my list and a favorite with most people. It's also a smaller tree, so if you're working with limited space, this could be a good tree for you. It doesn't get too big. It's usually good to plant under utility lines, especially if you maintain it properly. It's a butterfly host plant. The leaves are favored with leafcutter bees for lining their nests. It also provides nectar. One thing to note about this tree, though, is it is a Carolinian tree species, which means that where we are in Ontario, it's the most northernmost limit of where this tree will grow. So it's better located in areas that are kind of sheltered from extreme winds, just because in its southern range, it grows in much warmer temperatures. We also have serviceberry. This is also a really good smaller tree if you're working with limited space. There's lots of different types of serviceberries species. It's also known as Juneberry or shadbush, you might have heard it called. It's also a host plant. Birds love the berries, has really beautiful fall color. If you don't prune it though, it will turn into a very big shrub, but if you prune it regularly, you can maintain it as a tree. Purple flowering raspberry is really great. This is a shrub. it can become a very big shrub. So it's really good if you want to form a hedge or a thicket, if you're looking for privacy fencing, for example. It's really good for pollen and nectar. It's used as nesting materials for the bees. I always find bumblebees hanging out in these flowers. It's really cute. Nannyberry. This is a really great species. It's very adaptable to a wide range of different site conditions. It doesn't mind being a little wet, doesn't mind being kind of dry, it doesn't mind having full sun or full shade. It's a really great all-around wildlife shrub as well. It's a butterfly host, the flowers attract pollinators, and the berries attract birds. So this is one of my favorites. The next couple slides I'm going to show you are some species that you might want to consider if you have more of a wet site, or maybe you're thinking of building a rain garden, for example. This is red osier dogwood. It has really interesting red stems in the winter, so it's really interesting to look at even when all the leaves are gone. It's pretty good in wet sites. It's a host plant. It has really attractive flowers in the spring, and it also has berries that are very attractive to birds. Elderberry is another one that's good for wet sites. It's also pretty hardy. It tolerates flooding. It's pretty tolerant of road salt. So that's something to keep in mind. It's also very attractive to pollinators, and the berries are also eaten by birds. And this is my last suggestion. This is pussy willow. Pussy willow, and all willows for that matter, are very early. Their flowers bloom very, very early in the spring. So this is also a really good one to have if you're trying to bridge the gap between blooms and blooming seasons for pollinators. This one's also good for smaller sites. It's either a very large shrub if you don't prune it, or it's a small tree if you do keep it pruned. It's really good for wet soil, and it's also a host plant. So that's not an exhaustive list of native trees and shrubs that are good for pollinators. There's tons more. Honestly, if you just Google bees or trees for bees, you're going to find a lot more information about that. But those are some of the ones that I would suggest if you're looking to maybe put a tree or shrub in your garden to attract pollinators. And we're going to go into a question period, but of course, if we don't get to your question, or you think of a good question like 2 hours from now, feel free to give me an email at tara.mabon@toronto.ca. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tara. Great presentation. I have to say that I think that since we've met, I've become obsessed with, I was already obsessed with redbud, but elderberry is now on my list for the next shrub I'd like to add to my garden. So thank you for going over those lovely options. So please do populate the Q&A with any questions that you have, and we'll get to it. I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the one call. All of our PollinateTO grant recipients do need to remember to call the one call. It's mandatory. It's free, and it doesn't take very long, between 3 and 5 days, and then you have that report you can refer to for any of your future landscaping needs. So it's really important, and as Tara mentioned, it's the law. So please don't forget to do that this spring, this summer, this fall, whenever you're ready to start planting. Okay, so I wanted to just maybe start with a question, easy question. What is your favorite tree or shrub? I know you mentioned a few of them you really enjoyed, but what is your particular favorite one?
I really love serviceberry. It's a great native plant. It's a great native tree. It's really good for a number of yards. It's good in full sun or full shade. The berries are also edible, which is a plus. It's just a really good all-around tree, and it's really beautiful. It has four-season beauty. Like you get the flowers in the spring, you get berries in the summer, which are really pretty, and then it really does have outstanding fall color too. It's like a deep red, almost purpley maroon color in the fall.
I couldn't agree more. I have a serviceberry as well. I waited about 10 years to finally get one, and only because I didn't have the right spot for it. But once I did, it went in, and it's so lovely. You're right about having the all the season, displays, and so beneficial to pollinators and the berries, right, for birds and for humans to eat. Someone is asking about oak trees, and I know that oak trees. Some parts of Toronto are historically oak savanna, so the High Park area. Oaks need some sandy soil, but maybe you could talk a little bit about oak trees and whether or not they're suited for specific areas or not.
Yeah, certain types of oak trees, like you mentioned, black oaks, for example, and red oaks do really well on sandy soil. For example, there are other trees that are other oaks rather, like white oak and white swamp oak, for example. They're really hardy and they're not as picky. They don't require sandy soil, for example. Those are often used as trees in parks and as street trees. So those are good ones if you're looking for a hardy oak tree and you're a little worried that maybe you're a little close to a road, it might not like those conditions. So those are ones to look into. The only thing I will say about oaks is that they get really big. So that is something you want to keep in mind. You need to have ample space for an oak because not only is it going to get really tall, oaks also have a tendency to branch out really widely. So not only do you need the vertical space for it, but you also want to make sure you have enough horizontal space. Like it's not going to run into a building, for example. So that's just something that I would keep in mind when it comes to an oak. Another thing, and I only bring this up because someone actually complained about it to me once, is oaks do produce acorns, and if you don't want to clean up acorns, then you shouldn't get an oak. It's not usually a huge mess, but every few years, oaks will have what's called a bumper crop, and it will produce a lot of acorns, and you'll have them everywhere. So if you don't want to deal with that, maybe an oak isn't the best for you.
Okay, good advice. I know some of us have read Douglas Talamade's books where he really, really promotes oaks for all their benefits to pollinators, including moths and butterflies, and producing caterpillars for food for birds and that kind of thing. So we're all tempted to get an oak, but they may not be the best suited for our particular spot.
Yeah.
So thank you for that good advice. Someone is saying that they received a few elderberry stems that they're rooting in water. So how developed should the roots be before transplanting?
That is a really good question, and unfortunately I can't answer that because I've never actually had to plant or transplant elderberry from like a water rooting situation like that. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Yeah, as general experience with me and my houseplants, till they're pretty well developed, I would imagine. But you might want to do some additional research on that.
Yeah, that's good advice. I've never actually seen elderberry stems rooted in water, so
yeah, I didn't even know you could do that, honestly.
Yeah, me neither. So good luck. Do some research, and you can always try it out and let us know how it works out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let us know how it turns out. I'm curious.
Yeah. Someone is asking about the purple flowering raspberry and whether they have prickly stems like other raspberries do.
No, they don't actually. So that's another good reason to have them. They have, it's actually a very papery, kind of peely, I won't call it a bark because it's not very thin. Let's call it like a skin almost. There's no thorns though. And the raspberries they are technically edible, but they taste gross. I wouldn't bother eating them. So they're good for that. You don't have to worry about prickles. It's not like your red or your black raspberry, which have very, very sharp thorns or prickles on them.
Okay. Is there would the purple flowering raspberry or any other shrub that you can recommend be good for creating like a privacy screen or a hedge?
Sure.
What would you recommend?
Yeah, the purple flowering raspberry is really good for that. It gets quite large. It can grow up to, I believe, above 8 feet, even taller than that. So, and it has a tendency to spread outwards too, especially if you do some group planting. So usually if you're doing a naturalized planting or a screen planting, you want to group them in like groups of 3 or more. And it's a good screen one. Another one that's really good that I don't think I mentioned in my presentation is 9-bark. That's also a hardy urban shrub. It has really beautiful flowers in the spring, sometimes called common 9-bark. That gets quite tall as well and makes a good privacy screen. And nannyberry as well. I will mention with the nannyberry though, another name for it is sheepwool berry because apparently the berries can smell like wet sheep wool. So I will put that out there as a slight warning. I don't think it's an overwhelming smell, but I don't want you to get it and just be like, oh my God, Tara, this smells terrible. Why did you suggest this? But that also makes a really good screening shrub because it gets very, very tall as well.
Okay, thank you for the warning. We have a few questions about planting near a wall or up against a wall. What would your advice be for that situation?
For that, I would take it with caution. Like I mentioned, especially if you're planting a tree, the roots really do need space to expand outwards, and the branches also need that. So if you're planting a tree right up against a wall, you're going to probably have to end up cutting or pruning all the branches on that side. So you're going to have a very lopsided tree. You also don't want to get roots like right up against your foundation. That can cause some problems down the road. If it's shrubs, not as big of a problem. They're a little bit easier to deal with. The root systems aren't as big as a tree's, for example. They can also take more pruning than a tree, so you can shape them a bit more. There are some guidelines online for particular spacing requirements for trees. In general, though, my recommendation for spacing a tree is you want to make sure it's at least 2 to 3 meters away from other structures, which is hard to say, especially in Toronto. We're probably dealing with like limited gardening space, things like that. I would say if you are very limited space, try to go with a smaller species because you won't have to worry about that as much. But you don't want to plant a tree right up against a structure.
And generally you would look to see what the mature size would be and use that as your guide. Okay, great.
Yeah, like don't make the mistake of being like, it's really small now because like 20 years down the road, it's going to be quite different. You want it, whenever you plant a tree, just visualize that it is going to thrive and survive and it's going to live to a ripe old age. And whatever that size is going to be, you want to plan for that accordingly, like Anne-Marie said.
Is there any trees or shrubs that you would avoid planting near pollinator gardens? So we've all heard about walnut trees and they tend to release a toxin into the soil, so you wouldn't want to put your vegetable garden near a walnut tree. But is there anything like that for pollinator gardens where you'd want to avoid?
That's a really good question. I can't think of anything that would be incredibly detrimental off the top of my head. I would stay away from, I keep saying ornamentals like they're bad. They're not. There's some ornamental plants that are beautiful and they do produce pollen. But sometimes when you get an ornamental tree or an ornamental shrub, those trees and shrubs have been bred for very specific things, like they're very showy flowers, for example. They're really big and bright and beautiful. But sometimes those features that make them really big and bright and beautiful, like you'll get these double petaled flowers that have like several layers of flowers. They're really beautiful to look at. But it's also really difficult for pollinators to actually navigate their way through it to get to the pollen themselves. So I would generally recommend to stick with native ones. I'm a little biased though. I really like native trees and I try and push native trees whenever possible. So that would be my general recommendation. I can't think of anything that would have a detrimental impact on a pollinator garden other than maybe walnut, like you mentioned. Even if you are planting near walnut trees, there are definitely trees that can tolerate walnut toxicity. So you just need to do a little bit of research on that.
I think that's generally good advice to consider native plantings for our native pollinators, right? You mentioned in your presentation that relationship that's co-evolved over, thousands of years, millions of years. They have this special relationship. Some bees and butterflies can only go to certain plants. So if we can support them, let's choose those plants that they have that special relationship with.
Exactly.
Someone is asking about any evergreens that you may recommend.
Yeah, evergreens for pollinators, I don't know any off the top of my head. I mean, there are evergreens that are good wildlife trees in general. Another thing to take into consideration too when it comes to planting, you might want to incorporate evergreens as a windbreak, for example. Pollinators like bees and butterflies especially can't forage if it's really, really windy out, for example. So you can definitely incorporate like evergreen, like cedar, for example, which is a good bird one for nesting, and also their seeds are used by birds. But you can maybe incorporate that into your pollinator gardens as a windbreak. So during windy periods, bees have more shelter in which they can forage from other plants in the nearby vicinity. So that would be my suggestion. But I can't think of a specific evergreen that is good for pollinators. I don't know if there are any that are host plants, for example. It seems that deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves are usually the host plants. I'd have to look into that a little bit more. But really good question.
Yeah, and maybe we can think about birds benefiting from nest, like cedars, for example, are great nesting sites for birds. I'm saying this because my new office overlooks my neighbor's cedar hedge, and I am so entertained by all the birds coming in and out of there. So it's proven itself to be a wonderful nesting resource. And enjoyable for me, obviously. We have some questions about growing trees or shrubs in containers. Now, I know when you showed the tree anatomy with the crown and the root structure really spreading out, kind of like a wine glass with a stem.
Right.
So containers maybe wouldn't support that type of root growth, or what would you say about containers?
I don't recommend trees in containers. It can be done with varying success. I don't have a lot of knowledge on that because most of my experience with planting trees is in open spaces, lawns, naturalized areas. But what I do know, because of those things you mentioned, Anne-Marie, the way root structure works, like you can start growing a tree in a container. Whether it gets very large or whether it lives for a very long time is questionable. You might have better luck with shrubs, maybe some of the smaller shrubs. There's some really small shrubs out there like bush honeysuckle. Be very careful with honeysuckles though. There are a ton of non-native honeysuckles which are very invasive, but there is a native one to Ontario that's very small. That might work. I generally don't recommend it though. It's hard unless it's a very big container, like a very large raised garden, you might have better luck with that. For container gardening, I would probably stick with herbaceous plants or very small shrubs would be my recommendation.
Okay, so if you can get your tree or shrub into the ground, that's going to be the optimal growing conditions for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so we have a question. So first of all, thank you for talking about invasive species. It's so important. And on that note, we have a question about buckthorns.
Yes.
Now, I have a personal story to share, if that's okay. I happen to have a European buckthorn on my property that I have been wanting to get removed for many years. It came out today. So it's been a major victory, and I thought, how appropriate is that the buckthorn finally got removed, and we're doing this talk today. So that's my little story for buckthorns, but I'm wondering if you could talk to people about, first of all, why we don't want buckthorns in our city, and if we do, how they can remove them.
Okay, so removing buckthorn is really difficult. My first job with the city was as a natural resource worker, and basically my job was to remove invasive species like buckthorn, and it is constant battle. They're super aggressive. Man, I hate buckthorn. Anyway, it's hard to without pesticide, I'll be honest with you, and you cannot apply pesticide unless you have a license and you've applied for a permit to do it, so you can't go down that route, or most people can't go down that route. If you can catch it while it's young and you can pull it up, that is probably the best way you can do it. If it's been around for a long time, honestly, you're probably going to have to like get it removed by an arborist if it's really large. One of the reasons why buckthorn are so pervasive are they produce a lot of berries. And so they just grow like crazy because they make all these berries in the summer and they drop off and they start growing from there. So if you can remove it, or if you've just noticed it started to take root, if you can remove it before it starts making berries, that's your best option. Basically, one of your only options is just to keep cutting it back and back. If you keep cutting it back, eventually you're going to exhaust it. Like, you're going to use up all of the energy stores in its root system. I won't lie though, that will take a really long time. Usually you just got to be really persistent, or have a professional come and remove it. You can have it stumped, which is basically you cut it and then the stump is ground down. There's like a special grinder that arborists use to grind it down and help kill the roots as well. Trust me when I say, like, if you've ever walked in a natural area in Toronto or a ravine, you have definitely come across buckthorn. It is absolutely everywhere. It pushes out native trees. You literally have a forest of them if you let them go. Another reason why I don't like buckthorn is they're not really great for wildlife. Even though they produce a lot of berries, they're actually a natural laxative, so birds just poop them right out. So they're not even good for that. Yeah. Sorry, I could go on about buckthorn a lot. I really don't like it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It horrified me that there was a buckthorn on my property for so many years. So this is why today is a major milestone. And it's interesting about the laxative because for birds, because I guess that's how buckthorn spreads so effectively, because birds basically transported seeds everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a constant battle. So if you do have the opportunity to get rid of buckthorn, please do so. The City of Toronto thanks you.
Absolutely.
So we're almost at time, but I just wanted to ask one last question, and that's related to sort of prepping the site for your tree or shrub. So if you've had a sort of a long abandoned patch of soil that maybe hasn't had the most love, what would be your advice on how to prepare that area to receive a tree or shrub?
Well, one of the first steps is, if you have anything there like invasive species, you want to take the time to move that out. Or if you want to expose that site so you can do a lot of planting, not just you know, a tree or a shrub, for example, you can solarize it or tarp it if you've got a lot of weeds in the space. And basically you can put down newspaper or cardboard or landscape fabric to press the weeds down. And this takes a while. This might be over a couple growing seasons that you might need to do this. And basically it blocks the sunlight out and it kills everything else underneath it. Obviously, if you've got a lot of big trees and shrubs, that's not going to work in that space. But in terms of prepping the soil, if it's really compacted, when you're digging out the hole for your tree and shrub, you don't want to make the hole huge, but you might want to decompact the soil a little ways around it, because what can happen is if you plant your tree and you dig a really nice hole for your tree and you fluffed up the soil and it's really nice, but all of a sudden the roots start growing out and it hits the compacted soil around it, those roots are going to have a really hard time growing out. So that's something you might want to consider if you have compacted soil. That being said, dealing with compacted soil is really difficult. You can use like a rototiller, you can do some hand spading. It's hard work. That would be my general advice for that. And then just making sure you know, you've thought about all your possible conflicts, what other species are in the area that might conflict with your tree, the space, and how big your tree is going to get. So if you plan that out, you should be good.
That's great advice. And also, thank you for mentioning the mulch donut versus the mulch volcano.
Absolutely.
It's something I think about all the time if I see a tree incorrectly mulched. So remember the mulch donut, everyone.
Yes, please do.
So we're at time now, and so I just wanted to thank you, Tara, of course, for sharing your knowledge and profiling some native trees and shrubs we may be considering for our gardens. We will share the tree planting video that Tara showed in her presentation via email after this session so that you have access to it. So when it's time for you to plant, you'll be able to refresh your memory and have that video at your fingertips. Again, we're recording this session, so that will be available as well on Live Green Toronto's YouTube channel and the PollinateTO website. And I just also want to mention there is a list of trees and shrubs, a lot of the ones that Tara mentioned and a few more on the website. It's also with our list of native wildflowers. So there's 2 resources there for you to check out. If you're still trying to figure out what's best suited for your site, you can refer to that list. And yeah, I think the only other thing I wanted to mention for all of you PollinateTO folks or anyone else that wants to tune in, we are trying to arrange another session for next week on where to buy native plants. And we haven't settled on a date yet, but I will communicate that via email. So look out for that. It's going to be a great session to find out about all the different resources and nurseries and plant sales and things like that that are available to you to help build your gardens. So that will be communicated via email to you very soon, and we hope you can join us. So thanks again, Tara, for making the time, and thanks to everyone for joining us again for another amazing session.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye. Good night.